Thank you for tuning in to the post-legislative briefing by the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'm David Owen. I'm the president of the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce and Industry and our chief lobbyists. It is my calling to stand in that seam between the private sector and the public process, and the purpose of the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce is to make sure South Dakota stays an investment-worthy pro-business atmosphere. And that can get disrupted in a number of ways. Legislative sessions, ballot measures, rules that get made in the process of having a state government. I'll bring up some slides and we'll walk through what happened at this most recent legislative session, which was recently concluded. And this is always the most awkward part, slideshow. So let's begin the briefing on this last legislative session. And I don't know if you have the ability to edit, but my screen is not advancing. There we go. I don't know if you can cut that out, but if you can, let's go. Here's the legislative makeup. We look at this slide at all of our briefings. The Senate has 35 members. You can see the partisan split there, only 3 Democrats for this year and next year. The House, 70 members, 62 Republicans, 8 Democrats. We did set a record for the number of women in the legislative process. The old record was 26. We achieved that a number of sessions. This year we have 30. As you can see there, 9 in the Senate, 21 in the House. Here's what they do in their real life. We use a true citizen legislature. 54 with business and professional backgrounds. Some of those were ag-related. But this old notion that the South Dakota legislature is dominated by people in the agricultural world probably hasn't been true for a decade or more. And you can see here, 13 retired, 11 attorneys. That includes 2 former judges. I don't know if that's too many. I don't know if that's not enough. We have 11. Agriculture, farm and ranch people, 12, and you can see the rest of them from there. Here's the session by the numbers. Now, when you see that 195 and 283, 478, that's the number of numbered bills. A little bit of trivia for you. In South Dakota does something really smart. All House bills start with Bill 1000. Senate bills start with Bill 1. So unlike other states where you ask somebody about bill number 421, that could be either House or Senate. We have an automatic way of knowing that answer. What's interesting about the lines below, the Senate had 195 bills, 128 of those passed for a pass rate of 66%. Excuse me. 283 House bills, 118 only passed for a miserable pass rate of 42%. I had one of the House members, when I was doing this briefing for the Yankton Chamber, suggest the House had taken a whole bunch of appropriation bills that normally don't go through the House chamber and broke those away from the appropriation process. That might explain some of that. What's interesting, as you'll see in the next slide, 51.5% pass rate is pretty average, even if each house had a widely divergent experience. Only one veto. It was the veto of House Bill 1217. but uniquely enough, and we will explain this when I talk about House Bill 1217, it was one veto that got voted on twice. And I'll explain that in a minute. Here's a 10-year look at the number of bills and how many managed to pass the process and get signed by the governor if that's needed. You can see we had slightly fewer bills than last year, which was more than the year before that. It's been a long time since we've had 600 bills, but you can see the pass rate it hovers around 50%. You look at that 61% in 2015. I don't know what kind of love fest that was. Can't remember. I was there. Seems like too long ago. We do a number of processes during the session. Sponsors are allowed to withdraw bills. You can see that didn't happen very often. And as a further footnote, only one of those was a Senate bill. We use a process in South Dakota that's really unique. We can actually put a new bill in where an old bill was, because things become clearer through the process. And that's known as hog housing a bill. That goes back to the first time a whole bill was substituted under a bill title, which was done to build a hog house at SDSU. We hog bills. Again, fewer numbers. What we have started using, and we don't have a column for this, is what we call placeholders. They are bills that with a title, and the title's repeated as the body of the bill. And so you'll see a bill that says, strengthen the economy of South Dakota. And the body of the bill says, we will strengthen the economy of South Dakota. Bills like that are usually done by the leadership. We had more than 30. I think we had 40 some odd placeholder bills. They are valuable to deal with those situations that become better defined as the legislative process goes on, which I think accounts for the lower number of hog bills. But the disadvantage is you can have these placeholders go all the way through the House committee, House floor, Senate committee, and then only have the substance put in on the Senate floor or the House floor, in which case there's really been no public hearing or chance to participate. That's the downside of those. Look at that last column, emergency clause. The emergency clause makes a bill effective when it is signed. It is effective immediately. All other legislation becomes effective in July 1st, unless otherwise kind of specified. Two things happen when you put an emergency clause on. Bill becomes effective immediately, and it requires a 2/3 vote. That difference between 50 and 101 isn't a small difference. But the difference is almost exclusively the federal money, the one-time investments we made because of the federal transfers, and we'll talk about that later in this briefing. Those federal transfers were the kinds of expenditures that needed a 2/3 vote anyway. Most of them had emergency clauses put on them. I warned Mallory of this. Any questions you can think of that need to be better explained?
No, I think you're doing great.
All righty. Well, here's the course of what we're going to go through. Women in sports, we will talk about 1217 and that transgender bill. There was a number of topics that had multiple bills, marijuana, sports betting, and all of that money I just talked about. We will go through in detail. One of the most significant bills to the business community was some liability limits put on COVID liabilities, and you can see the rest of it is kind of oddballs, one-offs. It's a great process, but can kind of get a little goofy. So let's go to the hot topic first. House Bill 1217 is one of those bills that comes up very, very emotional, controversial. Um, you know, quite honestly, some of this process, quite honestly, it is worst. So let me separate a couple things. Let's talk about what the bill did. Then we can talk about what the proponents and we were opposed to the bill. We urged the governor to veto it. So let me be as fair as I can to the proponents and our opponent arguments. Then we'll look at the factual history of the bill's progress through the legislature and what this all means. The bill quite accurately discussed, it deals with people that are transgender, people that were born physiologically observable males that identify as females, wanting to compete in sports. The bill makes a valid point that the chamber's never disputed and opponents haven't really disputed, that says physiologically boys are different than girls. Testosterone levels, muscle density, lung capacity give them a competitive advantage. And in fact, one of the best references in the bill treats testosterone as a performance enhancing drug. But what the bill does is it just forms a straight ban that says, as you were observed at birth, you must be. And if you weren't a girl observable at birth, you can't participate in women's sports. It doesn't fulfill its analysis that talks about the advantage of performing enhancing physiology does in that process of just simply banning these people from participating in sports. It supersedes the High School Association, which since 2013 has been given responsibility for dealing with these issues, which they do on a case-by-case basis, working with schools, the schools that will compete, the parents, the doctors, and from what we can tell, we believe they've done a reasonably good job. If I have interpreted and remembered what they've said right, we've had about 4 cases that they've dealt with, the people, transgender females, wanting to compete. 3 of them were denied, 1 was allowed to, and the performance of that one student was not exceptionally better than females. And that's the fear that has driven this, and that's the soundbite that has driven House Bill 1217, is that we're suddenly going to see a significant number of boys signing up in girls' teams so they can win, so they can get trophies. The unstated assumption is that, well, then they'll go back to being boys. This has never happened. This isn't happening today and isn't going to. And this is the fatal flaw that the chamber objects to, because that soundbite is based on a fiction. And our other concern is the bottom of that screen. The economic consequences that have been visited upon North Carolina and some others. The proponents will argue, and factually accurately, that North Carolina's economy continued to grow. Well, that is true, but they lost hundreds of millions of dollars from conventions, NCAA tournaments. The NBA moved the All-Star game. And so we want to avoid looking like we're discriminating against an entire class of people. Not the least of which is we have more and more members that are reaching out to those communities to have an inclusive workforce. Here's the history of how 1217 went through the session. It had very significant support in the House. Came out of the committee 11-2, passed the House 50-17. But when it went to House State Affairs Committee, it was tabled or killed. We use a mechanism in South Dakota known as a motion to defer to the 41st day. 41st day doesn't exist. Why do we do that? That motion's debatable. A motion to table is not debatable. So that gives the committee members a chance to talk, which they do. just like us lobbyists, as evidence right now. So the committee kills the bill. There's a backup method in both the House and the Senate, where if 1/3 of them will stand up and say, committee, you made a mistake, we want to see the bill. It takes 12 of them to support that motion, and the bill has to be delivered. 16 voted to deliver 1217 to the floor. The most critical vote is the next one you see there, the vote to place it on the calendar. That's an up or down vote where the entire Senate says we want to debate it, or no, committee was right, let's leave it dead. Needed 18, got 18. So the next vote is to pass the bill. You can see two people switched and supported the bill for 2015. Governor then was under tremendous pressure on considerations that some felt weren't expressed at the time. She issues a style-informed veto. Her style and form suggested removing 2 sections to get the collegiate material out of the bill that was designed to keep the economic sanctions from being triggered. So the question on a style-informed veto, and by the way, the Speaker of the House, and there's been a very vigorous debate about whether she exceeded what style and form is really supposed to be. That doesn't really matter for the reason I'm about to explain. The question on a style-informed veto to the House or Senate is, do you agree with the changes the governor wants to make in a style-informed veto? The whole issue about whether it was a proper use of style and form becomes moot when only 2 members of the House voted to agree with her, and about 67 said no. So then what happens is the bill goes back to the governor's desk for her to either certify or not certify. She says, reasonably so, I can't certify that you've done what I asked you to do because you didn't. So she can't certify it, so it goes back to the Senate as a vetoed bill. A little debate about whether she actually vetoed it or not. That kind of becomes moot. The Speaker of the House rules that it has been presented as vetoed. And so you can override a veto, but it takes a 2/3 vote, which in a 70-member House takes 47 votes. They got 45. Close, but not enough. As a historical footnote, while they were debating the bill, literally, while they were debating the bill on the floor of the House, the Senate adjourned sine die. That means without tomorrow. That's their final adjournment for this legislative session. So the senators started all kind of wandering into the House chamber with the rest of us. And the House members thought they were just waiting to see what they were doing. Not the case, they were going on. The governor has issued some executive orders. Interestingly enough, the one that deals with high schools was aimed at the Department of Education, not the High School Association, which deals with these things. And she's ordered the Board of Regents to see what they can do. Again, the concern is aimed at this fear that a lot of biological males will start competing on female teams. So I will leave that here. It's not an issue that's going to go away, and it's not, quite honestly, it's not an issue that is set up well for resolution, because both halves of this, including the South Dakota Chamber, are kind of in an all or nothing mode, and that makes this kind of difficult. So, Mallory, you want to ask a question about that?
No, I understand it more now than I did before.
Oh, good. Well, that's why we're doing this. So we'll move on. And I should tell the audience, I don't know if you're going to chop this up. This is, I don't know, 45-minute briefing, and I'll try not to stall too many places. All right, let's go to marijuana so we can all relax a little bit. I should explain the red thing at the bottom of the screen. I went to find clip art that said marijuana, And last year during the campaign on Amendment A, I would type that in, and I got all kinds of leaves, pictures, buds, joints. This time I did it, it said no match. And I did it again to make sure I spelled marijuana right. So I got frustrated. I just typed in pot. That's a pot. It's a red pot, but that's a pot. I digress. South Dakota voters approved both recreational marijuana and medical. Recreational was Amendment A. That has been taken to court. We have two levels of courts in South Dakota. At the circuit level, it was found to be unconstitutional. It has more than one subject. This whole issue about the difference between a revision and amendment is kind of interesting. The circuit judge agreed that it was more of a revision, and that takes a different kind of process. And it gave direction. It directs the Department of Revenue, and there's some feelings that you can't do that. And so this issue of the constitutionality of Amendment A is now in front of the other level of our court system in South Dakota, the South Dakota Supreme Court. They've just asked for briefs. They're going to go through and do all their research. Sometime this summer, maybe late this summer, they should rule on whether the circuit court got it right or whether it's going to be constitutional. So that took all of the issues about recreational marijuana and kind of put them off to the side. In total, 11 bills dealt with marijuana. I think there's one or two other that were buzzing around that made reference to it. 4 Senate bills, 7 House bills, and as you can see there, 3 were passed and 8 went up in smoke, which is not the worst pun in the presentation, but one of the worst. So let's take a look at the bills that passed. House Bill 1061 is my favorite. We've made it illegal to smoke or use pot while operating or occupying a vehicle. You'd think we'd have done this years ago. We really didn't need to because pot itself was illegal. So now that we're going to evolve or conversely fall apart to the point where pot's legal, you kind of got to go back and say, look, don't be passing the bong around the car. And so we've clearly decided, this is a performance non-enhancing drug, and so it's illegal. 1203 you see there is an interesting set of situations. Marijuana continues to be illegal at the federal level, which complicates banking, which is regulated by the Federal Reserve. With some guidance of the Bankers Association, this was their bill, the state has defined with this bill what needs to be done so that as dispensaries become legal and open, which is going to take a while, the banking community can reach out and offer business-based banking relationships to that industry. Senate Bill 35 simply is an appropriation to both the Department of Health and the Department of Revenue for the staff time it will take to write the rules and come up with some enforcement. The bills that didn't make it include defining THC levels. This is worth a mention. One of the challenges that all 34 states that have medical marijuana, I can't remember how many now have recreational, one of the difficulties with marijuana is that we say you can't operate planes, trains, and automobiles while you're under the influence of marijuana, but there's no test that proves that that you're under the influence. THC measures use. We can prove you used it, and it stays in your system for weeks. But that's not impairment. That's not the same as blood alcohol. And so we're a long way from being actually able to measure the impairment with marijuana, which is going to make this an interesting legal question for the foreseeable future. Removing old convictions, how we're going to sell marijuana. The folks in the legal alcoholic beverage business, malt liquor, that's what I was looking for. stepped forward and said, look, this is going to be a process. You're going to have to card people. We're used to doing that. We should be the outlet that sells recreational marijuana, which happens to be the governor's worst nightmare and the chamber's worst nightmare. We don't want that many dispensaries all over the place. That bill went nowhere. And we're defining how it's going to be packaged and labeled. The bill that's most interesting, I'll spend a little bit of time on, is House Bill 1100. First of all, it started out as one of those placeholders that was put into the process by the Speaker of the House. The governor asked to use it and turned it into a bill that delayed medical marijuana for a year. Measures that pass by the people become effective the next July. That's going to come up here on another topic. July 2021, medical marijuana is in effect. She wanted to delay that to July 2022 to give time to write the rules, and which, by the way, is about as long as states have taken that have passed legal marijuana. The House floor, under a lot of pressure from voters, this is one time where you can see the effect of people kind of talking to legislators from home. They shortened that to January of 2022. So they took 6 months out of the extra time, sent the bill over to the Senate. The Senate added an amendment that just said, look, for an ounce or less, let's just make it legal, for crying out loud. We know where we're going, even if Amendment A is unconstitutional. Don't kid yourself. Let's just decriminalize marijuana. Send it back to the House, who said collectively, no, we're not going to do that. Bills have to be identical. So we go to a thing called a conference committee. The conference committee met, they couldn't agree on anything either. So the last step in this is both the House and the Senate agree to not accept the report and not appoint another committee. So the whole idea of a delay went circling the drain and went down. Effective July 2021, medical marijuana be legal. We had Revenue Secretary Terwilliger at a Zoom board meeting a week ago or so. He will tell you that they will give some basic structure to allow that to be legal, but the rules on dispensaries, all of the rules that talk about how the cards are going to function probably don't get done right away. That's just going to take some time. Mallory, I won't ask if you're a user, but I will ask if you have questions.
Nope, not at this time.
Safe, very safe choice. She works for a Chamber of Commerce, folks. Of course, she doesn't even know what marijuana is. Okay, next topic, sports betting. A number of bills here. A lot of people may have forgotten that we voted on this in November. Gambling in South Dakota is controlled by our Constitution. So when we make changes, we've got to do a vote of the people. So we have authorized with Amendment B that we want to be able to bet on sports teams. Gambling in South Dakota is controlled by a phrase in our Constitution that talks about inside the city limits of Deadwood. Here's an important exception to that. Federal law lets tribal governments have the powers and the same laws and access that states do on their reservations. And so we have a number of reservations that have the same games and the same setup that's allowed in Deadwood. So the sports gaming bills we're going to talk about for about 2-3 more minutes. Please know this will apply to all of the reservation or Indian tribal government controlled casinos as well. So the governor put in place, we need laws to give shape to what the Constitution says. The governor's bill, and she doesn't like gambling. She's been very clear about that. She wants it limited to the city of Deadwood, actually in a casino. the number of other groups that were active in that election had in mind that you would be able to maybe place a bet more conveniently than that. And so House Bill 1211 was put forth by the folks that have full liquor licenses. Now that's a controlled access point, and they wanted to be able to say, you know, while you're in the restaurant or bar, we will create some mechanism that you can place a bet on sports. And we'll do that through the city of Deadwood. Deadwood will set the betting lines, or a contract with somebody will set the betting lines, the money, and it will all flow through Deadwood. So it will collect the taxes that need to be in the report. This is how New Jersey treats Atlantic City, but allows sports betting throughout the state. So in a technical way, that's going through the city limits of Deadwood, but in actuality, it would allow people to avoid driving all the way to Deadwood. House Bill 1231 is the wide open version that we see in Iowa as an example, and that uses smartphones. You can debate whether a smartphone is it smart to gamble or not, but you can use your phone, tablets, computers, access everywhere. The governor's staff always used the line, "We don't want people betting on teams while they're in church," which always prompts me to say, look, I gamble enough just walking into church. I don't need to be betting on the Vikings to make it worse. So here's what happens. The governor's bill passes. Now, everybody that was supporting the other two bills also supported the governor's bill, because you got to do something. And so the governor's bill passes, and the other two come up short or lost their bet, if you want to continue bad puns. I know, I think there'll be some pressure through time to take a look at that House Bill 1211 mechanism to make this more available. So the good news is you can bet on next year's Super Bowl. I don't want to say going to Deadwood is bad news, but the challenge is you got to be in Deadwood in a casino to do that. Mallory, you got a favorite team you want to bet on?
Go Pat, go.
All right, we'll go. Let's talk about some of this money that's rolled across the state as a tsunami. Let me put this in perspective, and this is a slide that I've used a number of times. It isn't even mine. It came out of the Bureau of Finance and Management with the state economist, but it does show the scale that we're talking about for kind of one-time investments. And South Dakota's been fairly smart in not allowing this to drive up ongoing costs. South Dakota's whole economy is measured by gross state product, is about $55 billion. That's the line you see on the bottom. Here's the federal money, and this doesn't include the first 1.2 billion that we got, I believe, from the CARES Act. So this doesn't include the first round, and it totals $4 billion. That's almost 7% economic growth just from federal transfers. That's very significant. And we take no position whether it was all proper and good, but we've all seen the ravages of COVID, not just on people's health, but on the economy. So here's the money that can be available, and it's available two ways: direct federal transfers and federal money being used to cover ongoing expenses for a budget frees up some of those dollars to be used for one-time expenditures. Here's a list of where some of this money went. Where the governor has said for a long time she wants to spend $100 million to get broadband to everyone in the state. And those last few places are deathly expensive. So she can use 75 million, and she can take 25 of CARES money. So the total is 100 million. this is her second time to be making this investment. And it's, you know, I've had to admit these computers apparently are not a fad, and they're not going away. So she's pursuing a worthy end for South Dakota's economy. $50 million is being put in to match up to $100 million from First Premier Bank and Bank Card and Danny Sanford to create need-based scholarships. South Dakota is, I think, the only state that has not had a needs-based scholarship. We have Dakota Scholarship and some others, but this will be a way for people that otherwise would have no hope of affording higher education to do this. They also want to raise $50 million. So you're looking at $200 million sitting in the bank, and that will fund needs-based scholarships perpetually. $50 million to the Healthcare Trust Fund, 20 for bioproducts. You can see that the rail line from Fort Pierre to Rapid City, we've been dealing with that issue as the Chamber of Commerce for more than a decade, which allows me to pass along one of the fun facts with that one. That train travels like 10 miles an hour for 100 miles, requires a shift change. So having that rail line fixed is very significant to the economy. Some money to help Ellsworth get ready for the new crew and bombers, and hundreds of jobs coming with that cleanup. You can read those slides. One of the bills that didn't get passed was Senate Bill 155. This started out as a $5 million bill for economic workforce housing. Shortage of workers has plagued this economy for more than a decade. But, you know, as I say, studies show workers like to live indoors. And so the whole affordable housing, kind of workforce housing, is the second related vexing issue. Rapid City has a revolving loan fund. Sioux Falls has been involved in housing projects for a long time. The smaller communities among economic development folks wanted to get some help too. So in its second iteration, this bill provided $40 million that the governor intended to put into the Ready Fund and use as a revolving loan fund, and then bumped from 5 jointly to 10 each for Rapid and Sioux Falls to be used separately. When you watch an elephant grow that fast, it dies, and this one did. Plus, they discovered that they might have overestimated the amount of revenue available by 50 million. You got one bill to 60 million. There's your solution. So workforce housing continues to be an issue. Will be studied during this interim, and there's more money coming. The Biden administration has releasing more than $1 trillion. Everybody in those halls following this issue believes that there will be a chance to further study and decide what the right strategy is and put some of the future money towards that. Let me next turn my attention to House Joint Resolution 5003. This puts a constitutional amendment on the June ballot. So let me talk about what it does, and then talk about how it got on the June ballot and why it's on the June ballot, because there's an element of that the chamber thinks is kind of sneaky, to put it politely. But let's start with what this resolution does. South Dakota can only change its constitution by a statewide vote of the people. And so there's 2 ways that those ballot measures get on the ballot. One is the legislature itself can put them on the ballot. And the legislative rules in a book with a red cover that we call the Red Book, because we're not all that clever in this process. The Red Book says when the legislature does that, it will be on the general election. That comes into play in a minute. Again, I keep promising, what's this do? It will say if a ballot measure is going to increase fees or taxes, it needs 3/5 majority of the voters. That's 60%. A previous ballot measure passed decades ago forced the legislature, if they were going to increase fees or taxes, to have a 2/3 majority. That's 66%. And so we've been living with that. Those are different. It's different talking to a deliberative body than the masses. And so those are two different things. So step one of HJR 5003 is a supermajority vote for tax and fee increases. And it also says if a program proposed by a ballot measure spends more than $10 million in any of its first 5 years, that expenditure will also trigger the same 60% supermajority vote. Here's how this thing ends up on the ballot in June. When it was first drafted, it said June primary. In its first hearing in front of the House committee, they amended it to the general election, and they said, oh, the Red Book says we have to do that. Mentioned that previously. So it's on the general election as it passes the House committee, House floor, and the Senate committee. When it gets to the Senate floor, it's last. And by the way, this is a bill that the governor has no role. There is no possible veto. If both houses approve this, it goes on the ballot. On the Senate floor, you can suspend the rules with a 2/3 vote, which they did. And so that's 24 votes in the Senate. They suspended that rule that says they place it on the general election, and they put it back on the primary. I tried to argue the House had to concur using 2/3 vote. As it turns out, there's another rule in that Red Book that says when it comes to suspending the rules, it has to be done by either house. And so by a majority vote, they could place it in June, which didn't matter. 47 is 2/3 vote. In the House, they got 51 votes. So that was a fuss about not much. So it's on the election in June. What's that mean? Well, proponents argue that it just needs to be considered on its own because there will be other issues on the general ballot in November, which seems to me to be a silly argument. You know, 2006, we had 11 ballot measures. Everybody survived. The turnout, and here we're starting to question the motives of the proponents, which will apply to some and not others. Turnout in the June primary is way lower. Democrats have an open primary, Republicans are closed, but Republicans have most of the primaries because they field more of the candidates. That's an historical fact. So you're going to have a smaller base to get this passed, and it's going to be primarily Republicans. Now, everybody will get to vote on this in June. You'll get a Republican ballot or a Democrat ballot, and you'll get a separate piece of paper to vote on. This question is in June. Remember when we said ballot measures take effect in July? Well, when that happens in November, that's clear past another legislative session. When this one, if this one passes in the June primary, it becomes effective like 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later on July 1st. It is likely that in the general election next year, we're going to be voting on Medicaid expansion, which will spend more than $10 million in its first 5 years. So the other accusation and the frustration the South Dakota Chamber feels about this is this looks to be, at least arguably, is an attempt to change the rules on Medicaid expansion halfway through the game. South Dakota Chamber has not taken a position on Medicaid expansion. We did support Governor Dugard's proposal during his administration, but that involved changes with Medicare and Medicaid kinds of payments that won't be part of this ballot measure. But the idea that we keep changing the rules of processes is sneaky. Mallory, still with us?
Yep, I think you're making some great points.
See, that's a chamber trait too. Saying nice things to the people you've allowed to speak. All right. We'll go through a number of bills, just kind of checking them off. Let's start with the COVID-19 bill. We have limited the kinds of lawsuits that can come from people who got sick, either by working in a business or being a customer at a business. We haven't taken away that process, but we have said you're going to have to prove a level of negligence. You're going to have to prove a level of exposure that it was intentional. It's a 2-year sunset limited kind of time frame. And again, it doesn't prohibit lawsuits, but it does set a little higher standard. Coalition of 40 plus business organizations. It got started with the South Dakota retailers and the chamber and a couple of attorneys talking about what we should do. But I want to give credit to Nathan Sanderson and the South Dakota retailers. They tracked the detailed drafting and led the coalition through the process of getting 1046 passed and did a great job. Another bill we brought as the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce, it's Senate Bill 123. It allows a comment period during the process of how ballot measures get on the ballot. Once the language is formed and it's on its way to kind of the ballot, especially using the signature route, the language is given to the Attorney General, who has 60 days to write the official explanation. What's important about that explanation is it goes on the ballot. I've always argued, and I've helped manage 9 statewide ballot measure campaigns in South Dakota since I returned in '98. I've always argued that there's a significant portion of the electorate that is finding out about ballot measures reading that explanation. Under today's rules, the Attorney General takes 60 days, and it's like watching white smoke come out of the Vatican. Poof, it just shows up. Senate Bill 123 creates a 10-day comment period, so they will post on the website, Attorney General, what they're thinking on ballot measures. That gives the people that are involved, either in the issue itself or geeks like the state chamber folks that just follow these things because no one else will talk to us. Gives us 10 days and then gives the Attorney General 10 more days before the white smoke goes up the chimney and the official explanation is released. That 20 days got added on to the 60. So we've inadvertently pushed 60-day process to 80. I would like to work on that next, but the idea that that process of writing that explanation can have some public input, I think it was an important achievement. Less groovy bills, more kind of spiffy. House Bill 1094. One of the things the Nome administration has been doing is kind of looking at zoning processes, kind of looking at economic development as this moves forward and trying to stabilize at a minimum level, not completely putting their thumb on local control, but saying, look, we're going to do this as a baseline and localities can define things beyond that themselves. They did it with county zoning last year. They're doing it with statewide zoning here, worked with the municipal league, had their blessing. So as you deal with local issues, you might be aware of that. The South Dakota Chamber did not take a position on that one. There's a fee now for electric cars. We pay for roads with gas tax. Electric cars, annoyingly enough, don't buy any gas, and so they're not going to be helping pay for the roads. They're tearing them up. Those little buggers are heavy. with all those batteries. So this is a small start. You hear more debate about trying to get to a reported mileage kind of basis, and that seems like a lot of big brother to people, and the technology is a long way away. So we will start by requiring electric cars to at least throw in $50. There's only about 250 of them in the state. But as we said during the session, by the time there's 20,000, you're not going to be able to do this. So it's good to get a start on it. Senate Bill 177 sets some statewide rules for homeschoolers that want to do two things: take some classes at their local school, which they're continuing to pay taxes for, I would point out, or participate in activities. Again, this is part of that method I mentioned for 1094. School districts were really upset with this and have a reasonable argument that this has been left to local control, because, to be candid, mom or dad or the teacher at home schools and certifying that the student is a straight A student, schools don't know how rigorous the curriculum they bought, or how legit the tests they're taking are. So that was the debate. Again, we took no position on it, but it did pass. Juneteenth is a fun example of this process. First of all, what is it? Juneteenth was a holiday. Yeah, let me start. Juneteenth is a holiday that's celebrated around the country that honors when the folks, enslaved people in Texas, I think Galveston specifically, learned in 1865 that they had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, and that they were in fact no longer enslaved people. So that's worth celebrating and important in the Black community. Two bills surface. One, Senate Bill 71, says, oh, we'll have a working holiday. It'll be on the calendar and we'll kind of make mention of it, but we won't suggest the state take the day off or that kind of stuff. But it's important to recognize. We supported that. A lot of business groups supported that. Senate Bill 89 would have made it a state holiday, an official state holiday, which probably would have put pressure on governors to make it a paid holiday. The supporters of state holiday, quite honestly, just went for all or nothing. And so they opposed the working holiday idea, but then couldn't find the votes to make it a state holiday. So when you do all or nothing, sometimes you get nothing. So we won't have Juneteenth as a holiday. 1097 was one of those returning to that big immunization fight we had last session. This one was a milder version, but would still allow people to not immunize their children and still have them go to school. We oppose that idea. There are exceptions for religious purposes already in the law. And we just happen to believe the workforce and families are safe when people are immunized. So that bill died in committee. There was another bill, 1247, that would allow people in healthcare industries to, if they had moral objections, philosophical objections to procedures, this is mainly part of the abortion debate, to just not perform those procedures. There's a federal law that takes care of this, and so it's redundant of that. Seemed unnecessary, and in smaller healthcare areas actually threatened service. So we joined the opposition to that, and it failed on the floor. About 3 slides to go, so I hope your membership's hanging in, Mallory. I appreciate you being an audience of 1. The most important thing that's going to be done by this legislative session is redistricting. Every 10 years, we do a new census. That shows us where people are actually living. The federal law says under a guise that's known as one person, one vote, legislative districts have to have a population base that has no more variable than 5% between them. And so as populations move and shift, the boundaries between legislative districts moves and shifts. Done in the extreme, this is known as gerrymandering, and there will be pressure to keep certain districts Republican, certain districts Democrat. But our process is a legislative committee will do that and then report that work to a special session, which will take place in November. I did this presentation in Aberdeen, and the other person, Julie Johnson, was also presenting, and she said the dates are 8th and 9th. I had a little trouble confirming that. But here are the members of that redistricting commission that will be working on that. Next, everybody wants to know how property taxes are calculated. I've offered to do this explanation far and wide, and have never had anybody really ask. South Dakota uses a system that takes increases in assessed values to put downward pressure on the taxes themselves, known as mill levies. And the legislature sets the general fund levies for your local school. Why? Because the legislature determines how much we spend on general education, and a formula that's based on teacher pay, student allocation, and the fact that the state's going to pick up more than half of that, about 56, 57%. And so if your local taxes don't raise enough money to fit that number, the state gives you, the school district, the rest through a process known as state aid. So that lets the state control the general fund levy. The general fund levy for schools is also the only place in South Dakota tax law where we have different rates for different classes of property. When it comes to your city taxes, county taxes, the mosquito district, everybody pays the same mill levy. It's 1 mill, which is $1 per thousand. So anyway, the governor also made another important decision. Our law says that we will let cities increase revenue. We will fund schools with inflation or 3%, whichever is lower. She's decided, even though inflation was 1.5%, that they would do increases of 2.4% for the majority of the budget, which includes medical providers with Medicaid payments, which includes state employees, and which includes education through this process. The mill levies for general ed will go down about 2.4%. You can see those levies. They mean nothing to anybody but us geeks. So here's the dollars. $500,000 property, commercial, is going to save $79. Homeowners $38, and farm. Now, $500,000 is a kind of medium to small business. Nice house, scrawny farm. But that's the dollars that are shifting with this bill. It's always important. It's an annual process that we go through, and there's 6 of us in the state that even though we do this. And keep in mind, that doesn't automatically guarantee your taxes are going down, because that other process is still functioning. Assessed values are going down. Special education levy will also go down. This has actually been increasing for the last 4 or 5 years, as we have an increased number of people on that autism spectrum. Well, that's the most dynamic slide we have, and it's the last slide we have. I can't take questions, comments, or rumors, but call Mallory if you've watched this presentation and say, hey, get a hold of him, wake him up, got a question. Giant Vision, we're going back to a live presentation, April 28th in Sioux Falls. Business Day next year, you can't quite see it, February 24th, the Thursday after President's Day. I want to thank the Peer Chamber for being active. I want to thank, we have one board member, Glennis, at up there at Modern.
Midwest Construction.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, she's on my board. You'll be meeting the new president of the South Dakota Chamber very soon. Anyway, thank you all for sitting through this process, being part of the process, and good day.